Hi, it's Dwyer. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. Also, always 1776.com, a free site. Today is June 22nd, 2025. Nothing I say in this video should be construed as investment advice. I want everyone watching this video to do their own due diligence. I'm not a CFA. I'm simply a stock market observer who is sharing some investment ideas that interest me or that I may be pursuing. Your operating assumption should be that I may own any of the stocks that I mentioned in this video, and that the reason I own them is to make money. Trust no one, including me. Rather, consider this video to be an invitation to do your own due diligence and independent research concerning the subject matter I discuss. I believe it is worthwhile to study markets and our relentless search for passive income. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. First, let me direct everyone to a resource. It's free, right? In my opinion, it's very valuable. Imagine one of the world's best investors over the last 2+ decades sitting down without an interviewer and giving you a macro view on how he has made his investment decisions. And just imagine that investor doing so on an ongoing basis. The Daily Dalio on YouTube is worth watching. I hope at least some of the people watching this video give it a look after watching this video. The investor is Ray Dalio. Please Google him. Dalio is spelled D-A-L-I-O. Now let's talk about some broad economic ideas here. I'm not going to mention the U.S. bombing of Iran and the possible fallout. We'll save that for a future video when more facts are known. But let's just talk about the state of the world economy right now. Let me just say that you can't save housing long term. The bubble's just simply too big. It's an international problem, right? Whatever happened in earlier generations, whatever your parents' generation did, however they accumulated wealth, whatever the demographics of the past with the baby boom, etc., right? Just understand that in many countries around the world, you have a generation of folks in their 20s and early 30s, who cannot afford to buy a house in the neighborhood in which they were raised. Right? Just understand housing is hopelessly overvalued. It's still hopelessly overvalued in the United States, even with downward pressure in places like Florida. That can't be saved. In other words, however they debase the money in real dollars, the price of the median home in an area is going to start to drop, right? As it has already in places like San Jose, California, where I am, and San Francisco, right? Unsustainable, folks, is unsustainable. Likewise, you can't save the stock market long term. I know there are a lot of pundits out there talking about, how index fund investing has led to overinvestment, a lot of misallocation of capital, zombie companies having their stock bought because they're in an index. I think the reality is that the Buffett indicator shows that the stock market is about, almost 100% overvalued. So if something bizarre happens, right, let's say they cut rates to zero, which the Swiss central bank recently did, right? If we have a fiat party where we suddenly say, hey, we're cutting rates to zero, everyone has more money, that's going to be short-lived. Now, I'm talking about the housing market in aggregate. I'm talking about the stock market in aggregate. Just understand, there are always going to be some parts of the real estate market or some parts of the stock market that are going to do well. In fact, in a moment or two, I'm going to talk about a stock I like. But there is no way, there simply is no way that the housing market can continue to operate with the multiple on median income in areas that it takes to buy a house being as high as it is. There is simply no way, right? In your financial planning, particularly if you're thinking 5 years out, 10 years out, you need to consider that. Let me make another point too. You know, I have friends, they talk to me. My friends are good people, but they're lost on many financial matters, right? They'll talk to me. They will have, paid down a mortgage over several years. They will have used their wage income to do so. They will, boldly say, even as, let's say they bought a house, we'll use round numbers, for $100,000. I know you can't in most places these days, but let's say they bought a house for $100,000. And then the house, they sell it for $150,000 years later, right? They'll say, I made $50,000 on my house, right? What about the interest rate on the mortgage? Let's go one step further. If during that time period you knew about investments such as Bitcoin, Solana, Ethereum, right? Let's say during that period of time you understood that Amazon was moving into robotics, that Tesla was about to take off. Let's say this is before Tesla's recent stock market sluggishness, right? What about the opportunity costs of owning that house? Right, folks, it's not as simple as looking at a house and saying, gee, years later, I'm selling it for more than I bought it. That house might be the most expensive investment in your portfolio. If you knew about Bitcoin earlier on and you made a decision, you said, gee, should I buy Bitcoin at $10,000 or should I buy this house? And let's say you bought the house. Just understand, you may have lost money on the transaction, especially if you could have rented in the same neighborhood where you lived, right? Had a Bitcoin investment that's now worth over $100,000 a coin, right, with far more upside right now, in my opinion, just talking for myself, than, let's say, the housing market, right? Don't overlook the opportunity cost when you're making financial decisions. Now, you heard me say that the Swiss central bank has cut interest rates to 0%. Folks, the elites don't know what they're doing, right? They gave a Nobel Prize to Paul Krugman, who didn't know that the internet was going to be a major part of our lives. right? Understand, monetizing debt is nothing new, right? Just because someone went to some fancy Ivy League university or some other fancy university doesn't mean they know the secret to life. Let me say too, imagine if I told you that there was an event that literally costs the Chinese 600,000 Chinese people. 600,000 Chinese people minimum, right? You would think to yourself, my goodness, that's a worst case in a war. Right, folks, that was the one-child policy that ruined China demographically. And that decision, of course, was made by the Chinese government. Just because people have power doesn't mean they know what they're doing. Right now, the United States just crossed into owing $37 trillion. $37 trillion. Now, my point to you is that the way to fight that kind of debt, to discourage that kind of debt, to force owners of capital to make smart decisions, to shepherd their resources, is to have meaningful interest rates. Imagine how absurd it would be if your credit card company said, hey, you're having a problem dealing with your debt. You're up against your credit limit. What we're going to do is we're going to cut your interest rate to zero. Folks, it doesn't work. That's how you get housing markets like today's housing market. Right? It doesn't work. So, of course, in the United States, thanks to former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who was terrible, right? I don't care how smart she sounds in some 2-minute interview. She was terrible. Understand, she left a situation where we have to roll over between 9 and 11 trillion dollars of our debt. Right? So, of course, being a debtor, not the creditor, the debtor, right? We don't want to pay the high interest rates. So when President Trump talks about wanting rates cut, it's from the vantage point of wanting to lower the financing costs. Right? How could you possibly do that when government has had no financial restraints? When government hasn't shown an ability to even come within $37 trillion of balanced books. Right? So understand the fallout here. It's these things that happen off in the distance that actually impact things. The Swiss bank, and you know, the Swiss, you hear about Swiss banks, you think in terms of, the Swiss somehow having some sophistication when it comes to financial matters. You need to disabuse yourself of that thought process, because this zero interest rate policy is just absurd, right? We've been there before, right? It's absurd when the world is as heavily indebted. But understand what happens. People follow each other. Now, politicians who want to be reelected, who understand that, without some kind of interest rate relief, our debt servicing costs is going to be very high. They're going to push for lower rates. Understand what lower rates do throughout the economy. You have some companies that are struggling, and they're going to say, gee, you know what? we need to bolster our stock price. So let's buy back stock. Right now, folks, let's just say that might work if the market truly is not appreciating the strength of your financial balance sheet. Let's just say that's extremely rare, right? In my experience, when companies say, "Oh, we're going to buy back stock," they're trying to find some artificial way to boost stock price, right? Lord knows, history is replete with many companies who bought back their stock, and then when rates changed, let's just say the company was in a worse condition than they were before the stock buybacks. Right? When the share price kept dropping, now the company had, all these liabilities when they could have used their capital better. Right? So consider the fallout from zero interest rate policy spreading throughout Europe and hitting the United States. Lower interest rates, when it's loose money, suddenly the gold crowd realizes that, hey, they aren't paying interest on fiat, right? At least not meaningful interest. If I have $1 to spend, right, we'll call it $1 worth of capital, right? Why would I keep it in fiat when they aren't even compensating me with an interest rate for holding this treasury? Right? Wouldn't I be better off in gold? If they drop rates in the United States, folks, that's going to be a green light for things like gold, silver, which is hopelessly undervalued right now. Right? I know it doesn't seem that way. In the moment, things always look different. Right? Cryptocurrency, just understand there's a limit on Bitcoin. Right? It's a hard limit. Folks can't just say, "Oh, let's, drop rates, let's print money, let's force, banks and pension funds to invest in U.S. treasuries." Bitcoin's not involved in such shenanigans, right? Bitcoin's going to skyrocket. Ethereum's going to skyrocket. Understand, crypto slowly has figured it out, right? Many cryptos now have limited supply. Right? You have different corporate groups figuring it out. If you believe that Bitcoin is going to get to 200,000, it's a little over 100,000 as I make this video, within the next 18 months, then isn't there too much of an opportunity cost to devote your corporate money elsewhere? Right? If your regular line of business isn't generating that rate of return, aren't you better off shifting a substantial portion of your capital toward buying Bitcoin? In fact, if they're silly enough, think about what's going to happen. If they're silly enough to drop borrowing costs, then with cheapened money, you'll have an opportunity to load up on Bitcoin. Right? I'm personally surprised that some money printing country like Venezuela isn't actively printing worthless fiat and exchanging it for Bitcoin. Let's talk about a stock I like before I close this video. I see I'm 20 minutes in. Folks, the last stock I've bought is Uber. Now let me point out that there was a time when Uber and Lyft were competing with each other for the market. Right? There was a time where Uber wasn't making money. They were spending a lot on advertisements. There was a thought out there on whether they were going to survive. Right, folks? You need to stay up to the minute. Those times are in the past. Just understand, Uber's market share in the United States is 76%. Right? 76%. Globally, it's 25%. Uber has 171 million monthly active users. Right? Let me point out, too, that revenue has grown from $31.9 billion in 2022 to $44 billion in 2024. Right? Understand, the operating profit has improved from a $1.8 billion loss to a $2.8 billion profit. Right? In essence, you're buying a monopoly. Right? Again, in the United States, 76% market share. In other words, who's going to compete with me? I fly into San Jose International Airport. I'm tired. I want to get home. I take out my phone. I want reliability. What app's going to be on my phone? It's going to be Uber. Right? I understand. I will have never met the driver before in my life. But understand, on Uber, I can find out how many trips the guy has made for Uber. The driver can find out my history on Uber as a rider. Right? If it's late at night and I've just traveled across the country and I'm tired and I want to get home, I'm not going to go with Joe's unknown rideshare service. Also, think about the safety issues. Right? I have a daughter. If she's going to take a rideshare service, I want it to be with Uber. Right? I don't want to hear that she decided she was going to hop in a car with a stranger on some company, using some app for some new company just to save a buck or two. Right? Hell, I'll give her the buck or two. I'll give her $5 for her to go with a ride-sharing company that I consider safe. Right? So when you look at Uber, you need to realize there's a moat. Sometimes you're desperate when you're, hailing a Uber. You're thinking, man, I've got to make it to this meeting. I've got to make it to this hearing. I can't be late. I can't play games with anything other than a premium brand. Who's the standard? The standard in the United States with 76% market share is Uber. Let me also point out, too, that Uber, of course, is diversified. They now have Uber Freight. Of course, you have Uber Eats. Right? So if you wanted to streamline your existence, right? I like redundancy. I'll be blunt here. But if I wanted to do away with DoorDash, given that I use Uber, I could do that by signing up with Uber One. So, understand the existentialist threat in the room. Right? The idea is, who needs an Uber? When with autonomous vehicles, you don't even need a driver these days. Right? And the answer is, all of us. What I want people to do is to realize that Google, another stock I like, right? Alphabet, the parent company. Well, let's just say Alphabet's Waymo is rolling out autonomous vehicles as a service in Austin, Texas, and in Atlanta, Georgia. Right, folks? Just be aware that Uber has a partnership with Waymo. you'll be able to hail Waymo autonomous vehicle cars on Uber's app. Think about it. In other words, just like Google is dancing with OpenAI right now, Uber is dancing with Waymo. In other words, Uber is leveraging its brand name, its app superiority, and it's linking it to the driverless car revolution. Right? So, as Uber continues to dominate in the United States, just think of the international runway that it has. Right, folks? Its market share internationally is only 25% right now. Right? You can imagine an American traveling to the UK, they might be at the airport and they're thinking, gee, how do I catch an Uber? Right? The word Uber is now like Xerox used to be. Folks don't even know it's a brand name. They just think it's a ride service. Right? That's going to spread. Just food for thought, especially as Uber's connection with AV companies spread. Right? Let me also talk about the fact that Uber is attractively priced right now. Right? Its PEG ratio, price earnings over growth, is below 1. Right? Which suggests undervaluation for a company with its growth rate. Right? So do your own research. Right? Uber strikes me as in the sweet spot. You're really buying a monopoly, and the powers that be can do little about it. Because, of course, it's the best kind of monopoly. It's an organic monopoly. Right? So Uber is extremely well positioned right now, and it's attractively priced. I hope you give it a look. Those are my thoughts today. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.